Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Today, I'm joined by Emily Taylor to talk about strategic listening. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Emily, for those listeners who are hearing you for the very first time, can you give a brief intro of who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Emily Taylor, and I'm principal of teenyBIG, and I help nonprofits with strategic listening. So I know I'll get more into what that is, but it's really all about listening to stakeholders in your community and helping use that information to make important strategic decisions for your organization.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed when I was doing research on you is that I picked up on the wrong keyword. It's not just strategic, it's strategic listening. The listening, I think, is the key word. And then you, like you said, apply the listening or the what you hear as responses in strategic ways. So can you talk a bit more about how that works?
Yeah, I know it's a bit of a combination of two very common words. But together, the reason I put them together is that listening is very important. We gather feedback, we do surveys and interview people for a lot of different parts of projects, but sometimes we don't always know what to do with that information. And so the strategy, the strategic part is there because I use various processes that are rooted in human-centered design. And really, it's all about really trying to figure out what questions are you trying to answer before you listen. And so you can really listen for the right information that you need, as well as be open to new information. And then not only just gather that information, but translate it into something that's useful for whatever you're trying to achieve. So it's applying that qualitative research, but also with a strategy so that you're making the most out of it.
I have so many questions, but I wanted to get started actually with the name of your company, teenyBIG. How did you come up with a name like teenyBIG?
One of the things I realized as I was starting out, I didn't really know where I wanted to go with the naming, but one of the things that I'm just very passionate about is looking at things through different lenses. So, not just with your stakeholders, but also sort of zooming in into details and also taking some time to step back and zoom out at the big picture. And that's really where the name came from, is this idea that we can gather different information at different scopes of how we look at things. And I think that's really important so that we're not missing things that are important to our decisions.
So would you say it's kind of like you want to be able to see the teeny details and the big picture and zoom in, zoom out between those two perspectives?
Yes, that's a good summary of it.
Okay. So when you're listening, and imagine, or in order to listen properly, let's say, you must have the right questions to ask, because without the right questions, you can't get the right answers. So how do you normally approach an engagement? Let's say, how would you first engage with a nonprofit?
Really, it's about what their goals are. Usually there's a reason for listening. So for instance, a client I'm currently working with, they have to make some big decisions coming up. They have a leadership transition coming up, and they've changed a lot over COVID. And so they just had these questions, like they weren't sure how they were going to make some of these decisions and make them with their community in mind. So a lot of what we started with was just having those discussions. What do you want to find out? What are you concerned about? What are your fears? And that type of discussion just starts to lead to questions. And some of that was, who are we? Who do other people think we are? What are we good at? What maybe are we not as good at? And so I'm currently gathering a lot of information to really try to understand, help them answer some of those questions and give them some intentionality. So when they go to make these decisions, they feel grounded in who they are and what how their community will react to some of those decisions.
What are then some of the challenges you're trying to solve? Like, when would a nonprofit reach out to you or realize they need to reach out to you because of a certain challenge that they're trying to overcome?
Usually it's really early on. So there might be, like in this case, the example that I just gave, they're going to need to be doing a strategic plan, but they just didn't feel ready. They didn't feel grounded. So it might be a case where there's a big decision and you're just not really feeling in control of the situation and how your community is going to react to it. But it might also be reaching out to a new community. So, a lot of people their audience has changed over the pandemic. And so being able to take a step back and really get to know that community before you try to really turn them into donors or put out a new campaign. And, this process really helps you understand the feasibility of those campaigns and that outreach before you even start.
You mentioned quite a few topics there. So campaigns, outreach, donors. Is there any particular topic that is more commonly found in your practice, for example, things that you tend to notice most nonprofits approach you for this particular problem, or is it really just an assortment of problems depending on where the nonprofit is at that moment?
It definitely ends up being a range, but I would say, kind of this pre-strategic planning and pre-reaching out to a new audience are kind of the key entry points.
Okay. And then going back to my question that I was thinking about earlier in terms of the questions, do you normally have some kind of either qualifying questions or initial questions you can ask the nonprofit just to make sure that you are a good fit, like the services and the outcome that you're going to be able to deliver is a good match for the nonprofit?
Yeah, I think there's questions and then there's just what I listen for in how they answer a question. And so people need to be open to change. So sometimes, like what would success look like for this project? What would you like to learn and be aware of to make your decisions? And if people seem like they're set on certain expectations or they're maybe not willing to compromise or meet people where they are, I would think that would be a bit of a watch out. So obviously we always need to be mission focused in this work, but people who maybe want to be doing things in the way they've always done them are not the best fit for listening, because it really is about understanding what's happening outside of your organization, and being able to connect with people more strongly by making changes to skip over some of those gaps of understanding that people may have.
Okay, so let's imagine a scenario where the nonprofit wants to introduce what they do to a new community. They realize that this might be a challenge they can't quite accomplish on their own. They reach out to you. You qualify them, making sure that you are a good fit, that they're open to the idea of change. They have a good understanding of what success would look like. What would be the next step after that?
And then we really figure out how can we define who this community is? So I'll just give an example of an organization I worked for that really had an aging audience, aging membership, and they were looking to expand into, younger demographics, which they did have some people. So we really defined who is this group? What's that age range? Where do they live? What are some maybe identifiers for them, either in like the way they talk about the organization or, have they not been a member? And what we did for this particular example, this organization had quite a few Twitter followers. And our assumption was that the Twitter followers were in that younger demographic. So we put out a survey on Twitter and really qualified people. So, they lived in the United States. They were in a certain age range. They hadn't been a member. We asked them how they felt about the mission. And then I was able to connect with people, use that as a qualifier to then interview people all around the country within a diverse range and really try to understand why do they care about the work that this organization is doing, what confuses them about what the organization is doing, why they haven't become a member yet. And those were really important. The patterns that we saw were really important to helping this organization try to understand what they needed to do next to engage that group further.
And then once you've collected all this data, you've listened, they've given you all the great answers. I mean, there's obviously some kind of analysis and then some determination, some kind of recommendations that you might go through. What would that look like in a scenario like this?
In this case, it was really the strategy here was really about communication. What are those next steps that their communications team could take with them. And so it was really, creating some personas to understand who were these people they were reaching out to, where were they, what other outside, how else were they gathering information? So it gave them some hints to like, what kind of podcast should they be on? What kind of news sources should they be talking to? Also identifying some of the tensions. I find there's always something a little controversial. I shouldn't say always, but there's often these controversial topics. So for instance, this organization focused around sustainability, and there was a bit of tension of like, how many goals can you quickly achieve and show this audience versus like what was really important, what were some of these baby steps that were important to do. And there was kind of this tension of being able to show members and people following the organization progress, but also being very invested in long-term outcomes that weren't going to change on a monthly basis. And so there was this tension there of like, how do we, talk about things regularly with people and engage them, but also not always having a ton to show for it because it was a long-term outcome. And so by identifying these tensions, rather than ignore that, it allows their communications team to talk about that. Why can't we show direct outcomes on a monthly basis? What baby steps have we taken to tackle that long-term goal in small ways, and helping people understand why that's a tension. So those are some of the things. There's also just language that people use that might not be, when it comes to sustainability, there's a lot of terminology of fossil fuels and climate change and different ways people talk about the work that this organization was doing. And so it was helpful to know this younger audience was using language a little differently than the older audience. And so those are just some cues that communications team can pull from to, again, meet that younger group where they are and help them understand what the work that they're doing.
I'm curious to know what kind of outcomes. So once you've determined the path forward, you make recommendations. What basic outcomes can a nonprofit expect? We can keep on using this example if you would like, but the idea is, do you have any kind of metrics or way of showing your success, or their success, I should say, after you've engaged them?
A lot of the successes or the outcomes are, understanding who you are as an organization, understanding who you're talking to. So there's not a lot of, it's qualitative research. There's not a lot of direct metrics, but, because this does get passed on to the communications team. But yeah, we look to see growth in, if it's expanding an audience, we'll look to see increased engagement. So not just expanded audience, but how can you really get people who maybe are lurking and just following you to actually become members, become donors, move up in that engagement. But this work is really to lay the foundation for a lot of other people to then, take it and use it to engage people, to really understand the people they're working with.
Is there any particular deliverable that you have? Is it like a document that you produce with a list of recommendations and strategies, or is it more of a communication approach where you just, stay on and engage with the nonprofit to say, here are the recommendations, and you make sure that they're actually following them in time?
Yeah, I say my outcome is usually, or my deliverable is usually a strategy document, but it's tailored to whatever that next step is. So if it's communications, we're talking language, visuals, social media outlets that make sense. If it's something more strategic, it might be, more visuals around how do you fit in with your partnerships and what are some strategies to use. But I do always offer additional hours to make sure I'm helping organizations integrate this into their work, because it is a long-term game, and really applying, once you understand your community better and how you fit into it, it's a long-term game applying that to this next campaign, but also future campaigns. And so I really like to be available to help people integrate that and not lose sight of who they're talking to and who their community is.
I imagine that on the nonprofit side, they have invested all this time and energy to spend with you, and they would love to see they get the most out of their investment. And on the flip side, that you have also gotten close to the nonprofit and you kind of want to see the fruit of your labor. So do you normally have like long-term relationships with nonprofits, or is it case by case, or it tends to be more of, here's your strategy, good luck, and, maybe we'll talk at some point in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I always love it to be long-term and build that relationship and see where it goes. Isn't always the case, but I'm always checking in with my clients just to make sure they understand how to use the research that we do. And there's always stuff that comes up and it might question the initial strategy. So I'm always happy to integrate, because it makes me feel good to know that this work is getting used in a positive way.
To roll back the time for a second, I did ask you when you normally are involved in a project, and you said it was mostly when they're talking to a new community or a change in their existing one. Is there ever a moment where a project is currently ongoing, let's say for a few months, and they realize it's not going in the direction that they wanted to go in, or they're a bit lost along the way, that your services and your value can also be helpful in the sense of you're now working in mid-flight through a project as opposed to the beginning of a project?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. As we do this listening work, we can find things that we don't expect. I can't say I can think of an example where I've really shifted gears, but it comes to mind of a project I was working on where we were really looking for specific outcomes other than to better understand some of the partners that this organization was working with. And as we went through the interviews and talking with people, really found out the things that were most important to them that this organization was doing wasn't necessarily the things they were doing, but it was the feeling that it gave them. Maybe I'll step back and just explain this a little bit. There's an organization that was helps different small community groups in the city of Chicago. And they found that the small community groups really just appreciated that they weren't alone, and that the power that this organization brought to their small community groups, where a local politician might talk to them, or the local police groups, chiefs might talk to them, where if they were on their own, they didn't have that power. And so this is just an example of, as we were doing the work, we better understood what was going on. It wasn't about the little celebrations and the donations that were made. It was really about this power that the nonprofit was giving these small community groups. And so that kind of shifted our outcomes. We weren't really, I don't think there was a set specifics that they were expecting to find, but it changed how we talked about it. And so it was more this almost an emotional support that rather than focus on the programs themselves, they could focus on how do we deliver this feeling to people and use that for our outcomes versus, things they were using before.
I can't imagine it would be easy to deliver feelings. That's something that's so intangible almost. It must be quite a challenge. How did you overcome it?
The feeling was support and increased power. And I don't mean power in like a big dynamic thing, but this power in like someone who is struggling on their own or in a very small area to be able to be connected to, important people who make decisions, that power in that sense. And so it really wasn't about doing anything that differently. So just for some examples, this organization would do, they'd help organize some community celebrations. They would help the community clean up an area, kind of like a clean and green type thing. And so what we did is rather than change any of that, it was really, how do we infuse power into and togetherness into each of those things? And so that involved really emphasizing the people they brought outside that small community, bringing outsiders in. So making sure they were inviting local politicians, making sure they were getting volunteers from different parts of the city, whatever they could do to make that event feel more connected beyond that community. And so it was just these little tweaks that brought that sense of connectedness and power to these communities. And it's something, they're working on infusing throughout their programs throughout the year, but it allows them to just put a different focus on, let's worry less about the food we're serving and let's worry more about the connectedness we're bringing to this event.
You mentioned something earlier that triggered a thought. I've noticed as a Salesforce architect that nonprofits sometimes ask me how other nonprofits do things because there isn't always one way to do something. They kind of want to have a sense of that the nonprofit is heading in the right direction, or that they want to leverage other people's experience so they don't make the same mistakes themselves. Have you noticed scenarios where you repeat the same kind of best practices, for example, to various nonprofits?
Yeah, there's definitely just some best practices in qualitative research because it is tricky and not, certainly not all or most nonprofits are doing this, listening to their audience and using it to make strategic decisions. They might be doing it in some small ways, but as a bigger project, that might be relatively new. So there's some things like making sure you're listening to your audience and gathering their feedback, even if it is in small ways, before you really need their perspective, because giving feedback and being more connected to a nonprofit is part of relationship building. And so, I've had some nonprofits who really they're going to be making a change. They want to survey their community and they don't get a ton of survey responses. And that is part of, you have to build in a culture of people feeling like they can give feedback, that their feedback is going to be heard and used rather than just kind of put away in some document in a folder. And so I think starting early, even if it's small, is a best practice. Being able to remove biases. A lot of nonprofits tend to, they're so involved and connected in their work. They usually don't have a lot of time to step away from it. And so there's a lot of biases that can bring when you are trying to listen to people. So that's an area where, making sure you're not seeing things through your own lens, that you can hear how people are coming to your organization, what language they're using, where they might see things differently. And so removing biases can help us understand that.
Just to jump in, can you give us an example of what a bias might be or a common bias is?
Sure. So, I think when it comes to, nonprofits are I feel like very maybe better than for-profit organizations in terms of really understanding the diversity of communities they work with. So I think a more common one is just like this curse of knowledge, where you might be such an expert at what you do. Let's say you're an organization that focuses on autism, and how that occurs, the correct terminology to use, for various medical needs and things like that. And your audience might not understand that. They might be connected through a family member or, in a less direct way. And so it's hard to remember how you thought about things before you knew so much about autism or whatever your mission might be. And your audience is just new. They may be very new to it. And so that can be a bias where I'm going to give a totally different example, but if you're, working on feeding homeless populations, and you know that it's not just about the food, it's about the support, the policies in place, the things that might send someone to, someone might have the police called on them, different situations. Your audience might just think that, getting sandwiches to people is the most important thing. And it's easy to dismiss that because you might understand this bigger depth of the problem. And so that can be a bias that can prevent you from meeting that person where they think things need to be done and helping them understand this bigger picture of how policy and local representatives and systemic structure can affect that problem. And that person that that's new to your work just can't understand all that. And so you have to be able to kind of remember what it was like before you knew everything you knew and start to understand how do you communicate with that person where they are, because sometimes these problems are so big and people need to understand them in bite-sized chunks.
I like that expression, the curse of knowledge. So before I jumped in, I think you were heading toward a third best practice after listening early, removing bias. There was a third one, I believe.
Yeah, I think the third one is to be transparent. A lot of times when we do listening, be it interviews, focus groups, or surveys, we don't let the people whose feedback we gathered, let them know what we found. And, sometimes it can be complicated. You doing strategies, they might not understand how you're using it, but to do nothing, I think really discourages future feedback. People like to know that their time spent is helpful. And so being able to be transparent and connect with people in that way of like this, sharing some things that you learned, maybe some, surprises, maybe something fun. But also, sharing some controversy. Maybe you figured you learned something that was surprising and you might be a little scared to share. Those kind of things can help, make you vulnerable and build that connection with people so that next time they're not just going to ignore that survey that pops up in their email. They're going to really want to help you and support you by filling it out.
I've noticed there's a trend recently to be more genuine, that people are looking for a more genuine experience, a more genuine relationship. So I agree that being transparent shows, your pitfalls, your concerns, your fears, and your hopes and dreams at the same time, of course. So that makes total sense. I'm also curious about the opposite. So we talked about the best practices. I'm curious to know if there's any kind of pitfalls that you find yourself having to repeat often.
Yeah, they're of course connected to those best practices, but I think there's a lot of fears that come up when listening to people, and you're totally right. I think 20 years ago, maybe these strategies wouldn't be the same. We are in an era of transparency and people having more information and wanting to understand how organizations work rather than just kind of blindly trusting them to do the work that they say they will. And so part of being transparent is this fear of like, well, if we do listen to people, what are they going to say? What if we can't do what they ask us to do? What if they say they want, free tickets to our museum? Well, we can't do that. What if it doesn't, actually bring more people in or help us meet our goals? And so there's fears in what you hear, and then there's also fears in sharing some of that stuff back, especially if it's negative. But what I tell people is that the bigger fear is not knowing that negative feedback. If you don't know it at all, then you have no control over it. Where if you know it, you can find some way to address it, even if that's just like, we don't have the resources. Maybe if someone is willing to share those resources, we could make these improvements. And so I think just facing those fears and being able to understand that you don't really need to build this big shell of perfectionism around your organization, that we are in this era of being more transparent, more honest, and using that to connect with people. It doesn't mean you have to be completely share everything, but leaning into that a little bit, it can help build those relationships and make your community stronger.
Information is power, right? And the more information you have about how you can help will only make you stronger. And even if you don't implement all of them, to your point, I think you're right. Just having that knowledge and then deciding how to work with it and what to do with it is amazing. And you should never be afraid to receive.
Yeah. And, at the end of the day, a nonprofit's work is all needs to be filtered through their mission. So if people give you feedback and it doesn't fit your mission, you can be transparent and say that. People need to understand, and it doesn't mean that they need to control your work. You just need that feedback to help, build that community, build those connections.
Because I like tying things to technology, which, my love of life, at least one of them. I'm curious to know if you have any kind of, or do you normally recommend any kind of technology, or do you have any influence over the technology that nonprofits use? What is your relationship, I guess, with technology and strategic listening?
Well, there's some basic technology types. I wouldn't say specific companies, but just some technology that's really helpful in listening, especially now that we've opened up into a virtual world of listening. So, being able to have video chats and transcription services, survey software, things like Airtable that can help make sense of data that's collected from those methods. They're all very important, but I definitely also, because I'm connected with a variety of consultants in the nonprofit world, I'm always just aware of different technologies. And so as I, do work, because we're doing this research and strategy usually up front, it is a good time to also be able to help nonprofits think about how technology might make some of these recommendations that I give, might make them easier, might make them better, because a lot of technology now is about being more user-centered and making things easier for your donors, for people filling out forms. And so as we run into those feedback around things that technology can help, I like to be able to at least know who to connect them with and who to talk to figure out the best way to improve that without exorbitant costs.
Okay, so you would say that you identify a need, and then to isolate it, to really pinpoint which technology would be the best for that nonprofit, you normally work with a partner or maybe outsource that entirely to someone else who's more knowledgeable in that specific technology. Is that true?
Yes, yeah, I certainly can't say I'm the expert in that area, so it's helpful to have partners trusted partners that are experts.
Awesome. I've noticed on your website that you contribute somewhere between 5 to 10% of your business hours towards BIPOC-led nonprofits. Can you speak more about what that is?
Sure. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And really that effort came out of, in the US, the George Floyd protests of 2020, just really made me realize I needed to outwardly be more aggressive in what I did. And so I tried a few different things. I tried to be more outward in social media and in different community groups online. And it just wasn't using my strengths. I think I had some very difficult, I should say, not even difficult, unproductive conversations with people. And it didn't seem like the best use of my time and skills. And so I really took a step back and was like, well, what can I do? The work that I do is, it's really where my skill set lies. And so I decided to, put a percentage of my hours each year towards organizations that support people in those communities, and really helping these organizations listen to people. And it's been wonderful because it's something I just enjoy doing, but it's also just a great way to have some additional resources for nonprofits in that area.
It's a financial contribution, right? Of your revenue, of your profit per year kind of thing? Or is it volunteering time?
It's hours. So I'm doing projects, same types of projects I would do in compensated work. I'm doing just as a donated service.
That's awesome. I'm curious to know where would you like your career to be in a couple of years from now?
I'd really really love to see, I think listening is one of those areas where it's still relatively new for organizations. And so I'm often doing a smaller part of a project and letting that carry on through the nonprofit, with some integration, but not really being a long-term part of the organization. And so I'd love to see to build relationships where organizations are continuously listening to their communities annually, and being able to offer some packages that allow them to just really integrate gathering feedback from their communities into their work. So it's not just, okay, we do this in 2022 and then not again until 2030. Like really yearly, like follow people and see what's on their mind, what their concerns and motivations are, maybe different groups of people each year, but to be able to build a big resource for them on who they're connecting with and how that's changing over time, so that they can do more with that. And I just feel like that would be so impactful for the right organizations. So that's kind of where I'm leaning towards, more longer relationships.
I also imagine that learning is kind of like an onion, that there's just so many layers that you can get into on different ways of learning too, that there's probably a vast ocean of knowledge that still can be tapped into.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I find. Like I was referencing that organization before that wanted younger members, but the more as we dove into it, then you start to see, okay, there are, maybe people who really want to see them expand in certain ways, and other people who are just excited about, talking about the topic of sustainability. And so you start to see these different segments. And as you unravel some of that outer onion, you can start to understand that group of people in a deeper way and dive into each of them further as you have the time and resources.
Emily, this has been really insightful. Where can people find more about you online and perhaps get in touch with follow-up questions?
Sure. So, you can always go to my website. People can always grab a little time with me there. It's teenyBIG.com. But I am most active on LinkedIn, just under Emily Taylor, and always offering different just tips and things that I learn as I go through my journey of working with nonprofits. So it's a really great way to just learn, be part of the conversation, and ask questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Alex. This was a really great conversation.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.